He was the pinnacle of human potential. A man who had forged his body into a weapon and his mind into a philosophy. He taught the world to be like water, to adapt, to flow, to overcome. But on a humid summer night in Hong Kong, the flow stopped, the water settled, and the world was left with a silence so profound it could only be filled with whispers. Whispers of accident, of conspiracy, of a curse. This is the story of that night. This is the investigation into the evidence, the myths, and the man behind the legend. This is the untold tragedy of Bruce Lee's death. To understand the shock of his death, one must first understand the height of his life. By the summer of 1973, Bruce Lee was not merely a movie star. He was a global force. Enter the Dragon was his masterpiece, a film that would finally catapult him to the Hollywood A-list, breaking barriers for Asian actors that had stood for a century. But this superhuman image was a sculpture, painstakingly chiseled every day. Behind the icon was a man operating at a brutal, unsustainable pitch. His training routines were legendary, often described as fanatical. He existed on a strict, Spartan diet, sometimes consuming raw ground beef and protein shakes to fuel a body that burned energy at a terrifying rate. He was a perfectionist, not just in martial arts, but in life. And perfectionism has a cost. The pressure was immense. He was a businessman, a writer, a director, a father, a husband, and the sole standard-bearer for an entire culture on the global stage. He was carrying a world on his shoulders. And months before his death, the first crack appeared. The first alarm bell rang, not in July, but in May of 1973. Bruce Lee was at Golden Harvest Studios, working on post-production for the film that would define his career. Without warning, he was struck by a crippling, violent headache. He collapsed to the floor, seizing. Ushered to the hospital, doctors worked frantically. The diagnosis was as shocking as the collapse itself: cerebral edema. His brain was swelling dangerously, a condition often caused by extreme trauma, allergic reactions, or, as some specialists would later suggest, a body pushed far beyond its natural limits. Cerebral edema is a medical emergency. The brain, confined within the hard vault of the skull, has nowhere to expand. As it swells, it crushes itself, cutting off blood flow and oxygen. It is a race against time. Against all odds, Lee recovered. But the warning was clear. His physical system, the very engine of his legend, was vulnerable. The doctors advised complete rest. They told him to change his life. But for a man whose identity was built on an indomitable will, rest was surrender. He saw the episode not as a warning, but as a challenge to be conquered. He dove back into his work with even greater ferocity. The path was set. July 20th, 1973, began not with omens, but with routine. Bruce Lee had a series of meetings scheduled. His final appointment was at the home of Betty Ting-pei, a Taiwanese actress, to discuss a potential film role for her. In his next production, Game of Death, the meeting was businesslike. Present were Lee, Ting-pei, and producer Raymond Chow. They discussed the script for several hours. According to all accounts, around 5 p.m., Bruce complained of a headache. It was a recurrence of a familiar pain. Betty Ting-pei offered him a tablet of Equagesic, a prescription painkiller she had been given for her own ailments. It was a common drug, a combination of a mild tranquilizer, meprobamate, and aspirin. He accepted it, took it with a glass of water, and lay down on her bed to rest before their planned dinner meeting. This is where the timeline becomes forever frozen. He lay down to sleep and never woke up. When Raymond Chow tried to rouse him for dinner, he was unresponsive. He was not breathing. Panic erupted. He was pronounced dead on arrival at 9:30 p.m. The official cause of death would not be determined for weeks, but the world already knew. Bruce Lee was dead. The news spread like a shockwave, a collective gasp of disbelief heard around the globe in the cold, bright light of the autopsy room. The legend of Bruce Lee met the unassailable facts of forensic science. The coroner's report, a dry, clinical document, held the answers that many simply refused to accept. His primary finding was unequivocal: acute cerebral edema. His brain weighed 1,575 grams, significantly heavier than the average 1,400 grams, crushed by its own swelling. The secondary finding was the presence of equagesic in his system. The amount was small, not enough to be considered a lethal overdose on its own. There was no alcohol. There were minuscule, trace amounts of cannabis. The official ruling was death by misadventure. It was a verdict of tragic accident. It meant there was no intent to cause harm, but death was the result of a risk taken in this case. Taking a medication for a minor ailment that triggered a catastrophic, unpredictable reaction in a uniquely vulnerable body, but for a public that saw him as invincible, misadventure was an insult. It felt small, mundane, unworthy of a dragon. If he didn't die in a glorious battle, then how could he truly be dead? The human psyche abhors a vacuum, especially one filled with grief. And so, the myths began to grow. In the absence of a satisfying answer, imagination took over. The death of Bruce Lee became a blank canvas for our darkest fears and most fantastical stories. The assassination theory. This theory suggests Lee was killed by the Chinese triads, angered by his teaching of ancient martial arts secrets to Westerners, or by rival studios, or by a mysterious death touch delivered by a rival master. There is not a single shred of evidence, no credible threats, no witnesses, no motive beyond vague resentment to support this. It is a narrative built on the allure of a shadowy enemy, the family curse theory. This myth gained terrible traction 20 years later, with the equally tragic, accidental death of his son, Brandon Lee, on a movie set. The idea of a curse is an ancient human response to patternless tragedy. It provides a reason where none exists. It is a story of fate, which can be more comfortable to accept than random chance. The allergic reaction theory. This is the closest theory to the truth, yet it remains unproven. It suggests Lee had a specific, hypersensitive, allergic reaction to one of the components in equagesica, 1 in a million neurological response that caused his brain to swell catastrophically. This is plausible, but ultimately, it is a refinement of the misadventure verdict, not a contradiction of it. These myths persist, not because of evidence, but because of emotion. They are a testament to how deeply he was loved. To accept that he was killed by a simple pill is to accept his vulnerability, and by extension, our own. The myth allows the legend to live on, untainted by mortality. The funeral in Hong Kong was a public spectacle of grief, unlike any the city had seen. It was the farewell for a hometown hero who had conquered the world. His silver casket was carried through the streets, surrounded by a guard of honor from his dedicated students. But from the raw material of this tragedy, an immortal legend was forged. Bruce Lee, frozen in time at age 32, would never grow old. He would never make a bad movie, never fade from the spotlight. He became a perpetual symbol of youth, power, and potential. His death, in a cruel twist of fate, amplified his message 1,000-fold. Enter the Dragon became a monumental hit, but now viewed through the lens of tragedy. His words, once confined 2 martial arts schools, now found a global audience seeking meaning in his passing. He became more than a man. He became an idea. The idea that limitations are meant to be broken. The mystery of Bruce Lee's death may never be fully solved. We are left with medical probability, not cinematic certainty. But in focusing on the mystery of his death, we risk overshadowing the magnificence of his life. He was not a myth. He was a man who read philosophy voraciously, a man who danced cha-cha, a man who loved his family, a man who failed and got back up, a man who took the art he was given and reshaped it in his own image, and in doing so, reshaped the world's image of his people. Asterisk, asterisk, he did not achieve immortality by how he died. He achieved it by how he lived. With relentless passion, unwavering curiosity, and a profound belief that no obstacle, not tradition, not racism, not the limits of his own body was final. He was water, and water eventually finds a way.